You were sold by your people.
No.
A good price. You're mine now.
They counted out the grain sacks while I stood there in chains. 7 sacks. That was the number. 7 sacks of winter grain and a land deed pressed with my alpha's seal. And that was what my life was worth on a Tuesday morning in the Thornwood yard. The iron manacles were cold. Not the cold that bites, the cold that simply is, that settles into your wrists like it belongs there, like it has always been waiting for you. The rogue pack's emissary walked a slow circle around me the way a man walks around a horse at market. He checked my teeth. He actually checked my teeth. I stared at the sky and said nothing, because I had learned long ago that words cost omegas more than silence. My alpha stood 3 feet away and watched the grain sacks being counted. What they don't tell you, what no one warns you about, is what it feels like when the person your body recognizes as safe decides you are not worth the effort of looking at. It is not grief. It is not rage. It is something more biological than either of those things. A severing. Like a rope pulled taut for years suddenly going slack, and your whole nervous system scrambling to understand why the anchor is gone. My heart was doing something irregular in my chest. My hands were numb before the iron touched them. That was not the cold. That was my body understanding what my mind was still refusing to process. He had sold me. The man whose name I had known longer than I had known my own. He had looked at 7 grain sacks and decided they were worth more than I was. And he would not even look at me while he did it. I said his name, just once. Not to beg. I was past begging. Just to make him look at me. Just to remind him that I his fields, buried his dead beside him, that I had a name and a mother's grave in the pack cemetery and 11 years of mornings in this yard. He did not look up. The emissary nodded. My alpha signed the deed. Somewhere behind me a woman's breath caught, one of the pack mothers, and then silence. No one moved. No one spoke. I stood in the middle of people who had called me family for 11 years, and I have never felt more alone in my life. I want to be precise about that aloneness, because it matters for everything that comes after. It was not the aloneness of being in an empty room. It was the aloneness of being in a full one, surrounded by witnesses who had chosen in that moment to be walls instead of people. Every one of them made a decision that morning. Every one of them decided that the cost of speaking was higher than the cost of my chains. I remembered every face. Not for revenge, for clarity, because a woman who knows exactly where the walls are can plan her route around them. They fitted the chain between my wrists to a lead rope and started walking. And that is when I let myself think about the road. 3 months ago, a border market, an ordinary morning, herb bundles in my arms and winter cold on my face. The crowd shifted the way crowds shift when something significant moves through them, and I stepped back against a spice stall and looked up. He was already looking at me. Tall, dark-haired, an escort of wolves around him who moved like soldiers, but he had stopped walking entirely, this man in the middle of a parting crowd, and he was looking at me the way no one had ever looked at me before, like I was the only still thing in a world that wouldn't stop moving. My breath left my body. Something happened to me on that road that I do not have clean language for. The closest I can come is this. My wolf, which had been quiet my entire life, not dormant, just careful, just small, the way things become small when smallness is what keeps them alive. My wolf lifted her head. For the first time in years, she was not crouching. Something in her recognized something in him before my conscious mind had processed anything at all. And that recognition felt like a key turning in a lock I had not known was a lock. Neither of us spoke. 10 heartbeats. The kind of silence that presses against your ribs from the inside, that makes you feel the exact size and shape of your own chest. I didn't understand what I was feeling. I only knew it frightened me. The sudden certainty that something enormous had shifted, that the ground I was standing on was not the same ground I had woken up on that morning. Then someone said, "Your Majesty," and the spell cracked like ice underfoot. His eyes went urgent. He stepped forward, I stepped back into the crowd and ran. I learned his name the way people learn the name of a storm, too late to matter. King Von of the Northern Realm, the most powerful Lycan alive. And as the rogues fitted the lead rope to my chains, I looked at the sky and held that memory the way you hold something that burns, carefully, knowing the damage, unable to put it down. I did not let myself hope. Hope required a future, and futures were not issued to women in iron manacles being walked north toward Ashfall. I had 10 heartbeats and a pair of gold eyes. I decided that would have to be enough. The land deed made a sound when it unrolled. Dry parchment, official, final. And that sound is the one I still hear when the nightmares come. Not the clank of the manacles, not the emissary's boots on the dirt as he circled me. The parchment, the quiet, bureaucratic sound of a life being closed like an account that no longer balanced. Other pack members watched from doorways. I counted 6 of them. 6 people who had sat at the same fires as me, who had eaten from the same harvest, who knew my mother's name. None of them moved. One of the pack mothers pressed her mouth to her hand. That was the closest anyone came to protest. A hand, a mouth, silence. I want you to understand what I was sold for. It was not that I was valueless. It was that I was the wrong kind of valuable. An unmated omega with no family to protest, which made me a liability in a pack already stretched thin. The alpha did not hate me. That would have required a feeling. What he felt was the cold arithmetic of a man managing a resource problem. The grain would feed the pack through winter. The land deed extended the eastern grazing territory. I was the variable that balanced the equation. That was all. That was everything. I was alone in the middle of a crowd of people who had called me family for 11 years, and I understood then, truly understood, in the way you only understand things that cost you everything, that I had been permitted to belong, not welcomed into belonging. There is a difference. I know the difference now. The lead rope pulled taut. Before the pack gate, I let myself hold it one last time. The market road, the stillness in the crowd, the man who stopped walking, those 10 heartbeats that had no language in them, only weight. Then the gate opened. The road north stretched ahead of me, pale and cold and indifferent. I had been many things to this pack, a mouth to feed, a body to assign, a problem solved by a land deed and 7 sacks of grain. I did not look back. There was nothing left worth the effort. Ashfall was exactly what its name promised. Black rock and ash-gray walls, a compound carved into the side of a dead volcano, like something that had grown there rather than been built. Organic, ugly, permanent. The kind of place that doesn't need walls to feel like a prison. The oppression is architectural. The message is in the stone itself. Nothing soft survives here. The air tasted of sulfur and old fire, and the ground beneath my feet was compacted volcanic grit that absorbed sound the way a wound absorbs blood, quietly and without ceremony. They brought me through the main gate at dusk. I counted the guards, 8 on the outer wall, 2 at the inner corridor, 1 at the holding block who didn't bother to stand up straight when we passed. Arrogance in a guard is a door left unlocked. I placed him beside the rusted bottom hinge on the eastern corridor gate and the splinter in the 3rd step of the main stairwell that would catch a boot in the dark, and the way the torches on the northern wall burned lower because the bracket was loose and the wind came through a gap in the stonework. I was mapping before they had finished chaining me to the cell wall. Old habit. When you have spent your life in spaces not built for your safety, you learn to read them before they can be used against you. I speak as the woman they thought they buried. An ancient matriarch with silver in her hair and blood in her memory. My voice is low and unhurried. Velvet dragged over steel. Every word chosen like a blade from a wall of weapons. I do not waste breath on hysteria. I deal in verdicts. I have worn a crown, lost it, and learned the true mathematics of power in the ashes. When I recount betrayal, it is not with tears, but with teeth. When I promise vengeance, it is not a threat. It is prophecy. Let the narration carry the weight of centuries, the restraint of a predator who knows she will win, and the icy authority of a dethroned alpha queen who understands that empires fall quieter than people expect. The holding cell had 2 other Omegas in it. A girl who couldn't have been more than 16, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the wall with eyes that had already gone somewhere else to survive. And a woman older than me, maybe 30, maybe older because hardship compresses time on a face, who looked at me when I entered and said nothing, but moved slightly to make room. That small shift of her body was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in 4 days. I did not weep. I had done my weeping on the road, privately, in the dark hours when the rogue wolves were loud with drink. One night of it, the full, ugly, undignified weight of it pressed into my own knees so no one could hear. Then I packed the grief somewhere unreachable and started paying attention. The stone floor was cold enough to leach warmth through boot leather. The cell smelled of smoke and iron and the particular staleness of a space that hadn't been cleaned with any intention in a long time. Somewhere in the compound, something was burning. Not a cooking fire. Something larger. More deliberate. I noted it and kept moving. The eastern corridor hinge was rusted through on the bottom pin. The midnight watch rotated 20 minutes late consistently because the alpha who ran it liked his fire and his flask more than his schedule. The outer wall had a blind spot on the northern face where 2 guard paths failed to cross. I knew this by the end of my second day because I watched instead of praying, and watching has always been more useful. I was not planning to wait. I was planning to leave. What I did not account for, what cracked the careful architecture of my planning on the 4th night, was the sound from the cell beside mine. The girl, the 16-year-old with the hollowed eyes. I heard them come for her just after midnight. I heard the door. I heard her voice go from silence to a sound I will not describe because some sounds should not be given more life than they already took. Then I heard her stop making any sound at all. I stood at my cell door with my hands around the bars and understood with cold clarity that I was not planning an escape for one anymore. There were 3 of us in this cell. Whatever gap I found, whatever hinge I worked loose in the dark, it had to hold for 3. The calculation changed. The stakes tripled. The timeline collapsed. I pressed my forehead to the iron and allowed myself one thing, not hope, but a fact. A man on a road, gold eyes that stopped moving in a moving world. The memory of my wolf lifting her head for the first time in years, recognizing something she had no name for. 10 heartbeats. Then I let it go and went back to the work. I was still standing. I would keep standing. And when the moment came, I would not hesitate. What I did not know was that I had 4 days. On the 5th morning, the rogue alpha sent word to my former pack, a standard notification, asking whether anyone would be coming to claim prior bond rights before he exercised his own. My alpha's reply arrived by nightfall. No one is coming. She belongs to no one. The rogue alpha read it twice, then he smiled and sent for me. I heard his footsteps in the outer corridor before I heard anything else. My wolf, who had been so carefully still through everything, the sail, the road, 9 days of ashfall, went absolutely silent. Not the silence of calm, the silence of a body that has run out of ways to pretend the worst is not coming. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I gripped the torch handle and I stood up straight. The scout's name was Aldrich. He had ridden 4 days without stopping, road dust embedded in the creases of his face, his horse lathered to exhaustion in the yard below, legs trembling on the cobblestones. When a scout rides like that, the report has already announced itself before he opens his mouth. Vaughn listened without moving. An Omega, sold by the Thornwood Pack Alpha to a rogue faction in Ashfall territory, iron manacles, a lead rope, 7 grain sacks, and a land deed at the pack gate on a Tuesday morning. Dark-eyed, slight, unmated, approximately 2 decades of age. No family, no one who came forward to object. Aldrich finished. The war room was very quiet. Outside the window, the Northern Realm's capital went about its morning. Market sounds, a blacksmith's hammer, the ordinary noise of a kingdom that did not yet know what its king was about to do. Vaughn had been standing at the war room window with his back to the room. He did not turn around immediately. He stood very still, looking at the northern mountains through the glass, and the stillness in him was the kind that his General Rowan had learned over 4 border wars to fear more than shouting. Rowan started talking, carefully, diplomatic channels, the political complexity of mobilizing against rogue territory without pack council approval, the precedent it would set, the vassal lords along the eastern border who watched Vaughn's every military decision for signs of overreach. This would hand them exactly the ammunition they had been waiting for. Open war with Ashfall could fracture the Northern Realm's alliance structure. 3 territorial lords in the southern reaches had been looking for cause to challenge council representation. This would be cause. Vaughn turned around. Rowan stopped talking. Vaughn crossed to the weapons table, lifted his sword belt, and buckled it with the unhurried precision of a man who had already made every decision that mattered. He picked up his riding gloves. He said, without raising his voice, "Ready the army. Now." The war room erupted. His counsel came at him from every direction, voices overlapping, titles and treaties and territorial consequences stacking up in the air like kindling. Lord Calder from the eastern reaches, the council secretary with a list of ratified agreements, his war advisor invoking pack law, invoking precedent, invoking the border council's authority to sanction a king who moved forces without formal declaration. Vaughn walked through all of it, straight to the door, down the corridor, into the yard where his horse was already being brought out, because his stablemaster had learned that look over years of service. You did not ask questions when the king wore that expression. You brought the horse. By dawn, 500 wolves were moving north. Vaughn rode at the front, not behind the vanguard, not flanked by his guard, at the front, where the road was coldest and the distance to Ashfall was most honestly felt. Roan rode up beside him as the last city torches fell behind them and said nothing for a long time. Then, "She must be extraordinary." Vaughn did not answer. He thought about a border market. Dark eyes that held his without performance or pretense, pushing through a crowd and finding only her scent where she had been. 3 months of scouts. 3 months of being a king about it. He was done being a king about it. What none of them knew yet, not Roan, not the council, not the 500 wolves riding north, was what Aldrich had left out of his formal report. The rogue Alpha had sent a territorial notification 2 days prior, standard practice for a pack asserting permanent claim. The Omega had been selected. The marking ceremony was set for 5 days from now. Vaughn had 4 days to cover 6 days of road. And in the border council chambers 3 territories south, a formal complaint was already being drafted by 7 vassal lords, calling Vaughn's mobilization unauthorized. By nightfall, they voted to send their own forces to intercept him. 800 wolves against 500, with a king riding at the front who had not yet been told he had a second war forming behind him. Roan received the dispatch at midnight. He rode to the front of the column and found Vaughn already reading it by torchlight. Someone had gotten there first. Vaughn handed it back without speaking. Roan looked at his king, the man he had ridden 4 border wars beside, the man he had watched make impossible decisions and carry the weight of them without flinching. He looked at him for a long moment and understood with the certainty of someone who has learned to read a person completely, that there was nothing left to say. He pulled his horse back into formation. 500 wolves rode north into the dark, and behind them, 800 more were saddling up. Vaughn did not slow down. The night before the rogue Alpha sent for me, I went back to the road, not as comfort, as survival, the way a soldier counts remaining arrows, because knowing what you have left is the only honest thing you can do in the dark. It had been an ordinary morning, ordinary sky, ordinary cold, herb bundles in my arms. The crowd was loud, close, smelling of livestock and wood smoke. Then it changed, that pressure shift before a storm breaks, that drop in the world's noise your body registers before your mind does. People stepped aside, not parted, stepped aside, the difference between a river splitting around a rock and water shrinking back from something it recognizes as larger than itself. I stepped back against the spice stall and looked up. He was already looking at me. I told myself later that I looked away first. I am still not certain I did. What I know is this. He was not looking at me the way men in markets look at omegas. This look I had catalogued young, learned its variations, learned which ones required immediate distance. This had no category. He looked at me like I had answered something, like he had been holding a question for a very long time and had just found the last word of it. My wolf stood fully upright for the first time in years. Not aggressive, not afraid, oriented, the way a compass needle swings and then locks. A door opened in my chest that I did not know was a door. I ran because I did not know what to do with what was on the other side of it. Then someone said, "Your Majesty," and the crowd closed, and he was gone, and I was gone, and I have thought about those 10 heartbeats every night since. 40 miles north of Ashfall, Vaughn rode and remembered the same morning differently. He had not wanted the escort. 3 days incognito on the border roads, assessing conditions the way you can only assess them when no one knows you are watching. The market was the last stop. He had been thinking about grain prices and border patrol schedules and the weakness of the eastern watchtowers. Then his wolf went silent. Not calm, silent. The distinction matters enormously. His wolf was never silent. Through 4 wars and a dozen crises, and more rooms full of hostile alphas than he could count, it had always been there, restless, watchful, a constant low frequency at the base of his skull that he had long since stopped noticing the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. Between one step and the next, it simply stopped. The silence it left was so total it felt like a physical thing pressing outward from inside his chest. He turned. She was standing against a market stall with herb bundles in her arms, looking at him with dark eyes that held nothing performed in them. No recognition, no deference, no calculation. Just a direct, startled, entirely unguarded gaze, the kind you only see on someone who does not yet know they should be looking away. He stopped. He stood in the middle of a parting crowd, and his wolf, for the first time in 20 years, was completely, absolutely at rest. Not waiting, not coiled, as if it had been in motion his entire life and had been given, in this market, looking at this woman, permission to stop. 10 heartbeats. He counted them. Then someone said his name, and she stepped back, and he pushed forward, and she was gone. Her scent on the air where she had been. He stood at the empty stall and understood, with the totality of a man who has just recognized something irrevocable, exactly what had just happened. She looked at me like she did not know who I was, like I was just a man on a road. I have been looked at with fear, with reverence, with calculation, with desire. No one had ever looked at me like that, like I was simply there, present, real. I would burn every rogue stronghold between here and the sea before I let that look happen again and then disappear. What Vaughn did not know, riding hard through the fourth night with his army pushed past safe pace behind him, was that he was already too late for the original plan. The rogue Alpha had moved the ceremony forward, not 5 days, not 4, tomorrow at dusk. And in the border council chambers, the vote had concluded. 5 of the 7 vassal lords had sanctioned a motion to intercept Vaughn's forces and demand he stand down pending formal arbitration. Their combined forces numbered 800 wolves. Vaughn had 4 days of road left and 1 day of time. And Linda, in her cell, had just heard the guards say her name. I heard the war before I saw it. A sound like thunder that didn't stop, not the clean crack of a storm, but something sustained, something with lungs, rising and falling with the rhythm of bodies meeting bodies at full force. The outer gate. I had memorized the sound of that gate for 9 days. I knew the difference between it opening and it giving. This was giving. This was iron and timber losing an argument with something that would not be negotiated with, could not be turned aside, had decided that the gate was a suggestion rather than an obstacle. The ceremony was 3 hours away. They had dressed me for it against my will, cloth not mine, hands not welcome. My hair bound back while I stood absolutely still and thought about the rusted hinge and the guard who slept through the watch, and the 3 of us, and the plan that had been 2 nights from ready. I had worked the torch handle loose from its bracket 4 days ago. I gripped it now. The air in the compound changed. Through the narrow gap at the base of my cell door, I could smell it. Smoke thickening, the sulfur of the volcanic rock disturbed and rising, and underneath all of it something else cutting through the chaos, something that made my wolf go electric before my conscious mind could name it. Warm and dark and furious and achingly, impossibly familiar. I did not let myself name it. I positioned myself in the center of the cell, weight forward, and I told the 2 women behind me, "Stay down. Do not move until I tell you." The sounds got closer. I tracked Vaughn's progress through the compound by what fell. The outer yard first, then the guard post, then the inner corridor where the rusted hinge gave with a sound like a shot. Someone was moving through ashfall the way fire moves, not carefully, not tactically, simply forward, as though the concept of stopping had not been made available to them. Then I heard Brecken. Brecken was the rogue champion who had been the primary instrument of cruelty in this compound for 9 days. He had broken a man's spine with his bare hands in the yard on my 3rd morning, casually, as a demonstration. He weighed as much as 2 of me. He roared when he engaged whatever was in that corridor, a sound that shook the door of my cell and sent dust sifting through the gap underneath, fine volcanic ash that settled on the back of my throat with a taste like old iron. I heard Brecken hit the stone floor. He did not get up. 3 locked doors between me and the corridor. The first one went with an explosion of splintered wood. I heard the fragments scatter across the stone outside, heard a shard strike the wall of my cell. The second, faster. Stone dust filtered through the gap under my door in a thin, pale cloud, and I breathed it in without moving. Ash and pulverized rock coating my lips, my tongue, the back of my throat. The smell was stronger now, blood on stone, the specific copper dark weight of it, and smoke, and beneath all of it that other thing, that warm and furious and familiar thing that my wolf was responding to with every frequency she had. 6 heartbeats of silence. Then, the third door came off its frame entirely. The torchlight from the corridor caught him first, the outline of him filling the doorway, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, chest heaving. The spreading dark stain at his left side had the wrong color at its edges, too bright, too angry, the discoloration that comes from ashwood extract working its way through even a Lycan King's blood. His hand was braced against the shattered doorframe, knuckles split, blood in the lines of his palm and across his jaw from a cut above his eye that had been bleeding long enough to dry at the edges. There was a splinter of wood caught in his collar. He had not stopped to remove it. His gold eyes found me immediately. Across the width of the cell, through the dim torchlight and the dust still hanging in the air from 3 broken doors, through everything, they found me the way they had found me on the market road, with that same direct, searching, finally arrived accuracy that I had been carrying as a fact for 4 months. I had not lowered the torch handle. He looked at it. Something moved across his exhausted, blood-streaked face. Not quite a smile, too undone for a smile, but living in the same neighborhood. I said, "You." He said, "I found you." Then his legs gave. I crossed the cell in 4 steps and caught him, this king, this force who had ridden 4 days of road in 3 and fought his way through a fortified rogue compound and taken a poison blade and kept moving. I caught him before his knees hit the stone and went down with him in a controlled descent, both arms around him, one hand pressing immediately and hard against the wound at his ribs. The floor was cold volcanic stone. The air smelled of smoke and blood and the fine grit of pulverized rock that coated everything, my hands, his armor, the back of my throat. He was heavy the way large men are heavy when their body has given everything it had, and his temperature was already spiking, the fever radiating through his armor like a banked forge. His hand came up and found my wrist. The grip was weakening even as I felt it, but it found me with an accuracy that had nothing to do with strength. "Don't," I said, and my voice was not the voice I recognized as mine. "Don't talk, don't move, don't you dare close your eyes." His general appeared in the doorway with 3 healers behind him, took in the scene, his king bleeding on the floor of a rogue cell, held upright by an omega in a ceremony dress, and for a full breath simply stood there. "Now," I said to him, "he needs your healers right now." I had planned for every version of that door opening. I had not planned for him. I had not planned for what it would feel like to catch a man who had walked through a war to reach me. I held him on that cold floor, and I did not let go. I decided, in that moment, that I would not let go. The head healer knelt and examined the wound for 11 seconds. Then she looked at the general. "Ashwood extract, introduced directly to the bloodstream. His Lycan metabolism has slowed it, but the concentration is high." She paused. "Without the counter-preparation administered within the hour, the poison will reach his heart." She did not add anything reassuring. There was nothing to add. I looked at Vaughn's face. His eyes were still open, still on mine. His grip on my wrist had not loosened, despite everything his body was doing. He was looking at me with an expression I could not entirely read, not fear, not resignation, something that looked almost like trust, like he had gotten here and found what he came for, and was, at some fundamental level, at peace with whatever happened next. That expression made something savage rise in my chest. "I know where the counter-herb is," I said. "Ashfall keeps a medicinal store on the eastern corridor, second room past the rusted hinge on the left. There is dried thornvale root in the third clay jar from the left. That is the base component." The healers stared at me. "The preparation requires bruised thornvale, rendered fat, and clean water at a rolling boil for no less than 20 minutes. I will show you. I will prepare it myself if I have to." Roan looked at me. "The storeroom may be damaged, the breach. Then we find what survived and work with it," I said. "I have made do with less." I was already moving. The storeroom had taken smoke damage. The far wall was blackened. 2 of the shelving units collapsed. Clay jars shattered across the floor in a scatter of dried herbs and ash. I moved through it fast, reading the damage the way I had learned to read everything in Ashfall, for what remained, not what was gone. The third jar from the left had survived. Cracked at the rim, the seal compromised, but the thornvale root inside was largely intact. I lifted it, turned it in the torchlight, and made the calculation that I had not been certain I would have to make. The yield was reduced by roughly a third. The standard preparation required a full measure. I had 2/3 of one. I stood in that burned storeroom with a cracked clay jar in my hands and the sound of Vaughn's labored breathing carrying through the corridor, and I felt the weight of the decision settle on me with a specificity that I can only describe as physical. Too little, and the ashwood extract would continue. Too much of a modified dosage, thornvale in higher concentration, compensating for reduced volume, and I would be trading one poison for another. I thought about my mother's workroom, the hours she had spent teaching me to read dosage by weight and smell rather than measurement. "The herb knows what it is," she used to say. "Your job is to listen." I bruised the root between my palms. I brought it to my nose and held it there for 3 full seconds. Then I made the preparation. I did not know with certainty it would work. I knew that I had made it as correctly as the materials allowed, from knowledge I had carried since childhood and used every day in this stronghold to keep myself functional enough to plan. I knew that it was the best thing that existed in this room for his survival. It had to be enough. I decided it would be. I speak as the woman they thought they buried, an ancient matriarch with silver in her hair and blood in her memory. My voice is low and unhurried, velvet dragged over steel, every word chosen like a blade from a wall of weapons. I do not waste breath on hysteria. I deal in verdicts. I have worn a crown, lost it, and learned the true mathematics of power in the ashes. When I recount betrayal, it is not with tears, but with teeth. When I promise vengeance, it is not a threat, it is prophecy. Let the narration carry the weight of centuries, the restraint of a predator who knows she will win, and the icy authority of a dethroned alpha queen who understands that empires fall quieter than people expect. The head healer administered the preparation and told me afterward, once it was done, that it would be very close. She said it plainly because she was the kind of healer who understood that false comfort has a body count. The ashwood extract had moved fast and deep. The modified preparation would fight it, but Vaughn's body had been through a military campaign and a fortified breach before taking the wound, and even a Lycan King's constitution had a ceiling. I sat beside him in the covered wagon through the first night, and told myself I was there because I was useful. I knew the herbs, I knew the dressing intervals. I was the most alert person in the wagon, and that mattered. I did not examine the way my hands carried a faint tremor that had nothing to do with cold. I did not examine the way every small change in his breathing landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I changed his dressings every 4 hours. I brewed the fever reduction tea from the preparation my mother had taught me, the one thing she left me that no one could take away or sell or trade for grain sacks. When the fever spiked badly enough that Rowan appeared at the wagon entrance with a face preparing itself for the worst, I told him, "He's still fighting." Rowan looked at Vaughn, then at me. Then he nodded and went back to his horse without a word. I turned back to the man burning on the pallet and said quietly, to no one listening, "You are not allowed to do this. You did not ride through a war and take a poisoned blade and break down 3 doors just to lose to it in a wagon. That is not a story I am willing to tell." I talked to him in the dark hours, when the healers were resting and the wagon was quiet, and there was nothing between me and my own thoughts except the road and his breathing. I did not know if he could hear me. I talked anyway, because the silence had teeth, and I had learned in Ashfall that the way to survive a long dark was to keep your mind occupied with something other than the fear underneath it. I told him about the eastern corridor hinge, about the guard who slept through the midnight watch, about the girl in the cell beside mine, and what I heard on the 4th night, and how that single sound had changed everything about what I was building in the dark. I told him I had been 2 nights away from attempting an escape with all 3 of us. I told him, in a voice I worked to keep level, that I had not known if it would work, but that I had not allowed myself to consider the alternative. I paused. The wagon moved. Somewhere outside, one of the outriders called something to another and received a quiet answer. "I'm glad it was you," I said, once, quietly, to the dark and the sound of his breathing, and no one else. On the 2nd day, just past noon, his hand moved. I was changing his dressing. The wound's edges were calming, the Thornvale preparation working as I had calculated, the fever still high but no longer climbing, and I felt it, his fingers finding my wrist, not grabbing, finding, the way you reach for something in the dark that you are afraid might not still be there. I went still. His eyes opened, glassy with residual fever, working to focus, but they found my face with the same direct accuracy they had found me in the market, in the cell, every time. Some things do not require full consciousness to know where they are going. He looked at me for a long moment, then in a voice like gravel pulled over stone, "You were holding a torch handle." The sound that came out of me was not a laugh. It was the thing that lives next door to a laugh, that shares its walls. It surprised me so completely that I pressed my free hand over my mouth. His mouth curved, slow, exhausted, real. An expression that had been absent from his face for 30 hours was suddenly, unmistakably him again. Something in my chest that had been braced for 30 hours let go. And something else happened, something beneath language, beneath the conscious decisions I had been making since the manacles went on.
the rigid, hyper-vigilant state my body had been maintaining since the pack gate began, fractionally, and then more completely to unknot. His scent, warm, dark, carrying the particular quality of a Lycan King's presence that I now understood was not just power, but also, inexplicably, safety, moved through my nervous system like the fever tea moved through his. Slow, then everywhere. My wolf settled. Not cautiously, not provisionally. She settled the way she had been trying to settle since a market road 3 months ago, completely, with the finality of a creature that has found what it was oriented toward and is at last allowed to stop searching. I sat with that feeling for a long moment without trying to name it or manage it or put it somewhere safe. Then I finished changing his dressing. On the 3rd day, he told me about the market road. All of it. His wolf going silent, the 10 heartbeats, pushing through the crowd and finding only her scent. 3 months of quietly circulated descriptions, of scouts watching border markets, of being a king about it when everything in him wanted to be something less measured and more honest. He told me plainly, looking at the wagon ceiling, in a voice still rough from fever, the way you tell someone true when the weight of carrying it alone has finally become heavier than the weight of being heard. I listened. I did not speak. Not ready yet, not while the road was still moving under us and everything felt too new and too fragile to handle without care. That night, the wagon was dark, and I believed he was asleep. I said to the ceiling, in a voice small enough that only the dark could hold it, "I remembered your eyes every night in that place. I didn't call it hope. I called it a fact. Someone once looked at me like I mattered. I held on to that." The silence stretched long enough that I was certain the words had dissolved into the dark. Then, quiet and entirely steady, "You can call it hope now. You can call it whatever you want. I'm not going anywhere." I did not answer, but I lay down in the narrow space beside him and listened to him breathe, even, steady, stronger than yesterday, and fell asleep for the first time in 9 days without positioning myself near a door. I had been sold by people who were supposed to love me, and here was a man who rode through a war with a poisoned blade in his side and reached for my hand before he reached for his own wound. I did not know what to do with that yet. I decided I had time to figure it out.
We were 1 day from the northern realm when the second rider reached us. Not a scout, a court messenger, riding with the urgency of a dispatch that cannot wait for a king to stop bleeding. Roan read it. I watched his face do the thing I had not seen it do before, that particular alarm of a seasoned man confronting a problem he cannot immediately solve. "What is it?" Vaughn's voice came from behind me, rough but present. Roan came to the wagon entrance. "The Thornwood Alpha has filed a formal territorial grievance with the Border Council. He claims you conducted an unauthorized military action in sovereign-adjacent territory to retrieve a pack asset." He paused. "He is calling her pack property. And he is requesting, through the Council's formal arbitration mechanism, her return pending legal determination of status." Total silence. Furthermore, 5 of the 7 border lords who voted to intercept us have not stood down. They are framing this as a constitutional matter. A king who moves forces to retrieve a single Omega without council sanction sets a precedent that threatens every lord's territorial autonomy. They are calling for a formal hearing. They have enough votes to convene one. He looked at me. If the hearing convenes before Vaughn can formally register the mate bond, before there is legal standing that supersedes the pack property claim, the Border Council has the authority to order her transfer pending judgment. "How long?" Vaughn said.
7 days before the hearing convenes, 4 days' travel to the capital. Vaughn's hand found mine in the dark of the wagon. I held it. I had survived Ashfall. I had saved a king with a jar of Thornvale root in my mother's recipe. I had come this far on the specific, undefeatable stubbornness of a woman who had decided at the bottom of a rogue stronghold that she was not finished yet. The law itself was coming for me now. I was not finished yet. We arrived at the capital with 3 days to spare. The Border Council hearing convened on schedule. 9 lords, 3 council secretaries, and a legal arbiter from the neutral territories who arrived with the grim efficiency of a man who understood exactly what case he had been called to adjudicate. The war chamber had been rearranged for the occasion, the weapons table moved, the maps rolled and set aside, the room reconfigured into something that was meant to look like neutrality, but still smelled of ambition and old alliances. I had spent 3 days preparing for this room, not with legal counsel. I had none in the formal sense, no family name to invoke, no pax standing to cite. I had Vaughn beside me. I had 9 days of surviving Ashfall, and I had the same preparation I brought to every space that had ever tried to use its architecture against me. Complete knowledge of it before it could be deployed. I had read the Border Council's charter the night we arrived. I had read the territorial grievance my former alpha had filed, and the counter-documentation Vaughn's legal counsel had prepared. I had read the precedent cases. I had taken notes in the margins in the careful, still improving handwriting of a woman who had learned to read less than a year ago and had since worked through half a royal library. I was ready. The Thornwood Alpha's representative argued pack property rights, territorial jurisdiction, and the legal precedent that an unmated, unclaimed Omega remained under Pack Alpha authority until formal release was granted. He used the word misunderstanding once. The word landed in the chamber and sat there, naked, insufficient, surrounded on all sides by people who knew exactly what had been exchanged at the Thornwood Pack gate on a Tuesday morning. Lord Calder, seated third from the left, set down his quill and did not pick it up again. The legal arbiter's pen paused above his parchment for 3 full seconds before resuming. The chamber's silent verdict on that single word was delivered without a syllable being spoken. Vaughn's legal counsel presented the counter-argument, the sale documentation, the conditions at Ashfall, the marking ceremony that had been hours from completion, the mate bond registration formally recorded upon our arrival at the capital, the Northern Realm's established legal position that fated mate bonds superseded pack property claims under High King's law. The Thornwood representative argued that the bond registration had been rushed, potentially coerced, potentially— "I would like to speak," I said. The room went very quiet. The arbiter looked at me with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of the proceedings. The council lords looked at Vaughn. Vaughn looked at no one but me, his expression perfectly still, perfectly steady. "Whatever you need," that expression said. "This room is yours if you want it." I stood up. I spoke for 11 minutes. I described the morning of the sale with the precision of someone who had replayed it enough times to know every detail. The dry sound of the parchment unrolling, the emissary's slow circle, my alpha's eyes on the grain sacks while I said his name once to remind him I was a person. I described Ashfall, the compound, the cells, the guard who checked my teeth at the gate.
the girl in the cell beside mine, and what I heard on the fourth night. I described 9 days of mapping a stronghold I had never planned to wait in. Somewhere in the middle of it, not at the end, where I needed the strength to hold, my voice did something I had not planned. A fracture. Brief. The kind that comes not from weakness, but from the accumulated weight of telling a true thing in a room full of people who had the power to disbelieve it. The girl who had stood at the pack gate with her hands in iron was briefly, visibly present inside the woman delivering the statement. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then I recalibrated. I finished the sentence. I continued. I watched 2 of the council lords look down at their papers in that moment, not dismissively, the other way, the way people look away when something is too real to hold steady eye contact with. I described a king who had ridden 4 days of road in 3 with a poisoned blade in his side and broken down 3 locked doors. And then I said, clearly, for the record, for every lord in that chamber, I am not property. I was never property. I was sold by a man who lacked the courage to call what he was doing by its name. I am standing in this chamber because a king went to war for me, and I am alive because I refused to stop fighting for myself. I am registering my mate bond because I choose to, freely, fully, with complete understanding of what I am choosing, not because I have no other options. I paused. I have other options. I am choosing this one. The council may record that as my official statement. I sat down. The arbiter looked at me for a long moment, then at his papers, then at the Thornwood representative, who was no longer quite able to meet anyone's eyes. The property claim, the arbiter said, is dismissed. I became queen the way I survived Ashfall, quietly, methodically, 1 day at a time, with my eyes open and my hands occupied, not mapping guard rotations and rusted hinges now, but council dynamics and trade routes and the particular concerns of every lord and Vaughn's heptarchy, because knowing what people are afraid of is how you earn their trust, far more reliably than knowing what they want. Vaughn's council had looked at me sideways for the first month, an Omega from a border pack, no family, no political lineage, no history beyond the story of her own sale and the war that followed it. I watched them look. I said nothing. I learned everything, and I waited with the patience of a woman who has survived worse rooms than a skeptical war council for them to see what I already knew about myself. 6 weeks. Then Lord Calder brought a pack dispute to my council session instead of Vaughn's, without being directed to, because he had observed 3 previous resolutions and understood that the outcomes were better. That was the beginning. The bond I took on my own terms, on a night when the northern stars were dense and low, with no court and no ceremony, just Vaughan and the silence, and the words we had been building toward since a market road in autumn. I took it because I chose it, because the woman I had built in the northern realm, 1 careful day at a time, was not afraid of wanting things anymore. Months passed. I managed the Omega social structures of the court with a kind of attention that the council lords had not expected, and could not dismiss once it produced results. Disputes mediated before they became territorial grievances, pack members supported through transitions that had previously been handled with the blunt instrument of alpha authority and nothing more. I was not doing what queens in this world traditionally did. I was doing what I had always done, finding the weak hinges and the gaps in the schedule, and using that knowledge in service of something that mattered. Vaughan watched me work one evening and said, "You are reorganizing my court." I resolved a rusted hinge problem, I said. He laughed, fully, genuinely, the way he laughed when I caught him off guard. I had come to understand that sound as one of the most valuable things I owned. I knew before the doors opened. Roan had told me that morning, the Thornwood delegation, seeking formal trade restoration. The territorial grievance had been dismissed months ago, but the consequences had rippled through the Pack's relationships across the border territories. Pax did not like conducting business with a man whose name had been spoken aloud in a border council hearing in the terms it had been spoken. The Thornwood Pack was struggling. He had come to ask for help from the woman he had sold. He came in person. I had prepared for a representative, the calculated distance that had characterized his legal challenge. His presence meant either genuine desperation or some remnant of the man I knew before arithmetic replaced conscience. I was not certain it mattered which. The doors opened, and he walked in, and he was smaller than I remembered. That is always the thing about returning to the architecture of your own fear. The doorways are never as tall as they were. He walked with his head already partially lowered, the involuntary posture of a man who knows the room has reached its conclusions before he arrived. He did not see me at first. He addressed the court in prepared language. Trade restoration, good faith efforts, the Pack's genuine desire to move forward in productive relationship with the Northern Realm. He used the word misunderstanding once. It landed the same way it had landed in the council chamber, naked, surrounded by people who knew. I watched Lord Calder, seated to my left, absorb it with an expression of such contained precision that I almost felt something approaching sympathy for the Thornwood representative who had apparently not learned from the first time. Then his eyes found the throne. The not recognition was the part I had prepared myself for least. His gaze moving across me the way it would move across any noble woman, cataloging, dismissing, moving on, then snagging, coming back. I sat completely still and let him look. The weight I had recovered, the straightness of my spine, the Northern Realm's sigil at my throat, the absolute absence of apology in my expression, or fear in my eyes, or any version of the smallness he had known me to carry. The color left his face like water leaving a basin, slowly, then completely. I spoke before Vaughn could. Thornwood Pack requests trade restoration, I said. The request is granted, with conditions. I set them without notes. Trade would resume on a schedule that benefited the border communities most directly. The people who had watched from doorways and said nothing were not the same as the man who had signed the deed, and I was not willing to let innocent people carry the price of his choices. Grain, medicine, winter supplies, the things that kept ordinary lives functioning. He would send a delegate to all future negotiations. He would never personally enter the Northern Realm again, not for trade summits, not for council sessions, not for any occasion that the next decade might produce. If Thornwood required Northern representation, they would send someone who had not stood 3 feet from a person in iron chains and watched the grain sacks being counted. And he would live. This was the condition I had spent the most time arriving at, the one I had turned over in the dark until I found the shape that felt like justice rather than cruelty. He would live in the full functioning continuation of his life. Trade restored, territory intact, every material thing he had bargained for when he signed that land deed. He would have all of it, and he would look at it every day and know exactly what it cost.
know what he traded, know what the omega he had classified as a resource problem became. Suffering can be outlasted. Knowing lives in you forever.
I watched the full architecture of it settle over his face, watched him search for an angle, an appeal, a door left open anywhere in the structure. Watched him find none. The chamber was very still, the kind of stillness that is not empty, but full of a verdict being reached by everyone present simultaneously without a word being required. My former alpha bowed, lower than protocol required, lower than calculation would have dictated. I looked at him, this man who had not looked at me while he signed the deed, who had chosen grain over a person he had known since she was 4 years old, and I felt the last of the old architecture inside me go quiet. Not forgiveness. I did not owe him forgiveness, and I did not manufacture it for the sake of a clean ending. What I felt was something more final, indifference. The specific, hard-won indifference of a person who has rebuilt herself so completely that the thing which broke her no longer has any purchase on the new structure. He could not hurt me, not because I was powerful, not because Vaughn was beside me, but because the woman who had been sold for grain no longer existed in any form he could reach. "You are dismissed," I said. I did not watch him leave. Vaughn's hand found mine on the armrest, quiet, unhurried, private in the middle of a public room. His thumb traced once across my knuckles. I squeezed his hand once in return. The court began to move around us, the ordinary sounds of a room returning to business. I sat still in the middle of all of it and breathed in the northern realm. Pine and cold water and wood smoke from the lower city, and underneath all of it, that mineral, ancient exhale of mountains that had been standing since the first pack drew a territorial line. I let it go. The grief, the manacles, the dry sound of parchment on a Tuesday morning, the 7 grain sacks on a scale, the alpha who would not look at me while he signed the deed, the 4 months between a market road and a broken cell door, the fever and the Thornvale root and the cracked clay jar and the 30 seconds in a burned storeroom when I had not been certain and I decided anyway. The hearing, the 11 minutes, the fracture in my voice that I had recalibrated and finished the sentence through. All of it. I let it go. Not because it did not happen, not because it did not matter, but because I no longer needed to carry it to know who I was. It had made me. Every grain sack of it, every cold morning of it, every 10 heartbeats of it. It had made me, and I was standing here, on the other side, with Vaughn's hand in mine, and a kingdom at my back, and a court that brought me its disputes, because I had learned in the hardest possible school exactly how to find the weak hinges in any room and use them towards something worth building. I was done carrying what I had already survived. They counted out 7 grain sacks while I stood in chains. Today, lords wait for my word before they speak in council. Border packs resolve their disputes in my chambers. The woman who could not read a year ago has worked through half a royal library and is making notes in the margins. The Omega who was sold for an arithmetic problem has reorganized a heptarchy's social infrastructure and is being consulted on the next territorial summit. 10 heartbeats on a market road became a war. A war became a wagon. A wagon became a throne room. A throne room became home.
Vaughn's hand is warm in mine. Outside these high windows, the northern realm breathes its ancient pine and mountain breath, the same breath it was breathing the morning I walked through the pack gate in chains, before I knew this place existed, before I knew I would choose it. I chose it every day, the way I survived every room that tried to diminish me, deliberately, with my eyes open, one careful day at a time. They counted out the grain sacks while I stood there in chains. That was the last time anyone assigned me a value I did not choose for myself. My name is Linda. I am queen of the northern realm, and I was worth the war.